Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. It's your host, John Scardina. I am so excited for this episode. I have Kyle King back on the show with me. He was on maybe back in December, so several months ago. And so we thought it'd be fun to follow up on that conversation. Said, hey, we were talking in December, 2022 kicked over. Now we've been going through about 3 quarters here. How do we end the year strong? So lots of different things. The last time I talked to Kyle, I believe he was in the Ukraine. That has gone to heck since then, and he's in Germany now, but he's really our expert overseas. He leads some really great things. He can talk about that in a minute. But Kyle, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me back. And yeah, the world has really changed in just a number of months. Sometimes I can't believe it. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
So last time I talked to you, I think it was pretty late at night, and you're obviously a pro because you're able to keep up. But I see it's light out over there. You're in Germany. You're smiling. These are all good things. But yeah, the world has really shifted, especially at the time of this recording. Literally yesterday, Putin announced the annex of additional locations in Ukraine. So just as a situational awareness update, before we talk about this year, really, and how to finish the year strong as an emergency manager, your perspective, you were in Ukraine. I believe either you were evacuated or you shifted over operations to Germany. Give us the lowdown.
Yeah, thanks. So I had spent the last couple of years in Ukraine. I was working with an international organization. I was seconded by the U.S. To that organization. So I was working in southern Ukraine around the Odessa region. And so I was in Ukraine up until about 10 days before the Russian invasion. So we were evacuated by the U.S. We were all forced to leave. And you sort of, you get one of those phone calls, which is like, okay, when are you leaving? And I said, maybe next week. And they said, how about tomorrow? So I said, okay, no problem. But anyway, yeah, you're right. Our operation shifted. I started working with the team and trying to get the rest of them out, after the conflict started. And it was really, it was somewhat dramatic. I woke up, I was getting a lot of messages at 4:00 in the morning on February 24th saying that the Russian forces had invaded from the southern region and up through Crimea and came into the Kherson region where there's a lot of fighting today. And so it's quite dramatic. And yeah, the entire world has sort of shifted from them and seems to have escalated quite a bit, which I think really applies to what a lot of people are working in the field of crisis and emergency management. I think we really have to pay attention to what's happening.
There's always I was talking to George Siegel on his podcast, Tell Us How to Make It Better. And he talked about, from an outsider perspective, he's a weatherman. He said there seems to be a crescendo moment in disasters. And it's like, well, of course there is in some ways, because you can't always prepare. Sometimes eventually it gets to response, right? And a lot of different things. Hopefully it doesn't get to that. But in terms of that crescendo moment for Ukraine, it's your heart goes out to these people that you just hear these harrowing stories, and yet you wonder what is ground truth. And for somebody who's spent so much time over there, who is thoroughly involved in terms of ground truth, are the assessments made by media in the U.S. accurate? What are some of the things that you were like, man, I wish people knew like X, Y, and Z about what was happening?
Well, there's a lot that really applies, especially for those that work in our field, especially in terms of emergency management with the way that the crisis is unfolding in Ukraine. And one of the conversations I like to have is in terms of comparing of what's happening in Ukraine, but also say the hurricane that went through Florida. And, one of the ways that we look at this is like if you take in Ukraine, for example, it's just a cascading system of disaster after disaster after disaster. And it's been, just an enormous amount of, heartache and heartbreak and infrastructure and failures in terms of systems and procedures and everything that we normally in that emergency management field typically work with, right? Yeah. We have our policies, procedures, and systems, and everything sort of the redundancies are in place. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is an absolute failure and collapse of the institutional systems. And so it always prompts in my mind, how would we deal with that? So if you use the example of the hurricane in Florida, just imagine, and this is one topic I'd love to talk about, is sort of, the degradation of societal resilience as time goes on. And so this is something that's extremely sort of important to think about, because if you take the hurricane in Florida and then say we recover from that, we're a resilient society, we recover, we get back to say 95%, but then we're slammed with another hurricane, and then we recover to 80%, and then another one, and then it's 70%. And there's so many effects from that we just have to deal with in terms of displaced populations. I think people don't really understand. Millions of people have left their home, they've lost their property rights, they've lost their documentation, passports, everything. There's no payment systems, they can't get their pension. There's so much in the details of what people don't listen and understand that are really make it a very complex situation to manage.
Real quick, we're going to pause for this week's Disaster Tough endorsements. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today. The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapse and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at L3Harris.com right now. Sawyer Products offer the best, most technologically advanced solution for protection against the sun, bugs, water, and injuries. Everything from water filtration systems to insect repellents, time-release technologies, really amazing stuff. So whether you're at home, work, or at play, make sure you check out Sawyer at Sawyer.com. Okay, let's jump back in. Gosh, and as you're going through that, I'm just naming all the things that are, life impacting, and yet don't really make the news. There was a story that I have, and I kind of touched on it last week with Patrick McGinn, good friend of ours who does. Who's a first responder. I'll just say that. I'm going to keep it kind of vague. There was a moment where we thought we lost him in the hurricane. I was talking to him on FaceTime 2 or 3 hours before the eye hit, saying, "Hey, why haven't you evacuated? Get out, get out." He lives in the Fort Myers area. He said, "There's no way out now. I can't get out." And he heard a loud boom on FaceTime. It cuts out. I called his son. I called the head of USAR for that area. I talked to everybody. Nobody could get a hold of him for more than 24 hours. They finally sent a boat down there, and his house was gone. All of his stuff was gone. His business gone. But they found him helping neighbors in another place. And I was able to connect with him, obviously, after that. Just him naming off every single thing that he's like, I don't have this, I don't have this, I don't have that, I don't have any access to this. Your heart really goes out. The big difference between hurricanes, and we're kind of switching gears here towards 2022 perspective and beyond. You talk about being in the details, and I love that. The detail of the hurricane as nature goes through and destroys critical infrastructure. The insanity of trying to take over another place and at the same time destroying everything, knowing you're going to have to rebuild it, is a pretty stupid mentality to me. I don't know, but either way, being in the details, a lot has shifted in 2022 so far. 3 quarters in, potential recessions, prices up and down. Salvation Army is starting getting requests about gas now instead of just people. So, being in the details of 2022, what are some of the big lessons learned for you so far, and how do we end this year strong?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think there's sort of 3 key points that I'm still trying to wrap my head around to a certain extent with a certain level of detail. But I'll start sort of larger and then come down to a specific point which I have been thinking about recently, and I don't have a great solution for it, but I've been thinking about it in terms of a hurdle that we have to overcome with our communities. And so starting sort of with the focus of the United States, because a lot of us are looking at the Ukraine conflict through the lens of the United States, and we're very protected in the United States, right? So oceans on both sides, Canada in the north, Mexico in the south, we're very, very well protected and secure. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of that is when we watch how societies are changing, as you mentioned, the energy crisis, inflation, the economics of everything, banking systems and everything, and I read a really interesting article recently about how, FEMA may cause us to lose the next war. And the premise of the article was we've lost the civil defense mentality. And so we've lost this mentality of when FEMA shifted, say, from civil defense to all hazards approach, then we lost that sort of ingrained civil cooperation mentality, and that we've lost this sort of urgency for the civilian populations to be prepared for things, and we've addressed it in terms of natural disasters, which is fine. That's fine. But I wonder now, as we head towards the end of 2022, and there's really only about 8 weeks left of this year, counting holidays and things. But are we seeing going back to civil defense as being a path forward? Not the way it used to be, but inheriting sort of the times of today, the technology of today, and what do we need to do today in terms of resilient communications and systems and communities. And so I see an overarching theme coming back. We've had these discussions with some of my colleagues in NATO, which is like, everything we're talking about now in terms of NATO resilience and NATO baselines, which they're putting out to nations now in terms of what nations need to do in order to be resilient with telecommunications and infrastructure and mass casualties, like the exercise you were working on. These are coming out from organizations like NATO, which is ironic because it used to be civil defense, and so it's ironic that we're going back in time a bit. And I'll sort of just leave that first point in case there's something else you want to add to that.
No, I actually think, well, I do have, I can always talk. I'm a podcaster, so there's no problem there. But really, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about, NATO specifically, even the DoD side in the U.S. and kudos to, Task Force 46. We've had Colonel McKinney on here, and the U.S. Marines. People are starting to say, hey, comparing what's been going on in the last 20 years in the Middle East to World War II, there's actually a lot of different lessons, and they've forgotten a lot of those lessons, i.e., how to deal with populations. When your entire infrastructure, your people, you're talking about mass migration, yes, but sometimes millions of people can't leave. And how do you take care of those people, i.e., World War II, when everybody stays? And there is a problem. You mentioned, populations preparing, whether it's civil defense or otherwise. There was a mentality before that you first had to take care of yourself. You look at Puerto Rico, specifically in Hurricane Maria, they were actively saying on the news, the government officials, I thought FEMA was just going to come here and solve all my problems. You're just like, uh-oh, there's an information gap here, but there's also a lack of preparedness. And when people respond wholly on government, whether it's natural disaster or the big boom stuff with war, there's going to be a severe lack of resiliency. Now, my audience will probably laugh at me because I always push back on resiliency as not being the king, i.e. Kyle King, but resiliency has its place. And in terms of civil defense, yes, absolutely. We need to get back to looking at, from a government perspective, taking care of infrastructure, from a people perspective, taking care of yourself and your neighbors first before people are able to get to you, even long term, right? So it's Ukraine is an actively evolving warning sign for everybody else who has to deal with war potentially. Because what do you do when you have nothing?
Yeah, absolutely. And, those are the affected populations that we continually deal with, especially with international crisis, is like, okay, it's always the people that can't evacuate. So it's always, and we generally, couch these things under sort of, we might call that, for as one example, women, peace and security programs, because those populations are disproportionately affected by conflict. Right. And so those are always a focus of the international organizations. And what I find most fascinating as we're watching this is, and it doesn't have to be a war at home, right? But it's like prolonged periods of instability. And that could come in many, many different ways. And I think that's really a teaching point for us, because we're watching prolonged periods of instability. I'm still wrapping my head around it as I try to formulate it, but we're watching these long periods of instability, which lead into degrading services and capabilities to the public. And I'll give one example. So I sit in the UN sort of coordination meetings and that happen. And, we're talking about, or at least they're presenting information on how many hospitals have been destroyed by the Russian Federation, how many have been targeted. And so if you think about your, level 1, level 2 trauma centers in your own community, and then you lose one, and then you have to shift that population to somewhere else, and then you lose those, or clinics or fire stations, and having to continually respond, continually to try and mitigate the effects of instability with degrading service delivery. And I don't think we've sort of exercised to a point of where we are able to have that type of redundancy, or really that type of mentality, and how are we just going to continue to the point of failure, and then see what that really looks like. And
There,
I'll give it. Go ahead.
please, no, please.
I'll give just another example, is because if you just simply turn on the TV and you see videos coming out of Ukraine, and there's always a drone that hits a building or a missile hits a building, it's always the firefighters are out there. They're still putting out the fires. You still have to deliver public service. You still have to have hospitals. You still have to have doctors. Systems have to function, and
Mm.
you're doing it in a prolonged period of instability. But eventually, those systems start to degrade over time. And what I sort of phrase, even though you don't like the word very much, but I call it sort of degrading resilience, right? We
Mm.
can't bounce back anymore. And you can only bounce back to half as what used to be yesterday. So
I would like to clarify that I'm not against resiliency. I just think we talk so much about resiliency that we forget how to mitigate and how to respond. But yes, resiliency absolutely has its place. And you know what the Mike Tyson quote, right? Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Emergency managers have to deal with the punch in the face, punch in the gut, really. And I think what you're saying is true. I was trying to think of the term that you might be able to help me out here. It's an economics term. You're using the word degrading, and I think that's accurate. People think that, especially the public, when I can't work in this hospital, I can just shift everything over. And that's never true. It's not true in industry. It's not true in emergencies. It does degrade, and there is a ramp up period. Sometimes that spurs innovation, and that's really great. Sometimes it's disruptive, and that innovation is like the worst, right? And so I just remember from college days, gosh, 15 years ago, right? The In studying economics and thinking, okay, if I was going to, the problem set we used in class was two factories. If one company has their own factory and they buy another company and they loop those processes and over, those people can't automatically move over and function at that same level. The same thing goes with critical infrastructure, the same thing goes with systems, the same thing goes with business, i.e., you can't expect somebody who is an engineer to lose everything, migrate to a different country and operate even as an engineer or another company, another industry. And I see that all the time in the United States. People think, why do migrants have an issue or immigrants have an issue with performing high level immediately in the United States when they were a doctor, an engineer, accountant in their host country? And people forget that there's needs to be a lot of education, which is another part of the mass migration problem is the lack of education, language, cultural norms to get people back up to speed, so they're not in either emotional or existential crisis. So I'm just so many problems. I mean, it's just getting more complex. But basically, emergency managers are still dealing with hurricane response season right now. We're still in wildfire season. Something else could happen. Uh, Global affairs are definitely real, and they could get worse, right? And so, what are your priorities if you're sitting in these UN meetings? What are the priorities walking out of here? It's like, okay, like this is what I need to focus on to make sure that we can stay resilient.
yeah, that's a great question. I think, one of the things that we've been really focused on is just trying to achieve the next objective and the next step. Like as you mentioned, these problems are so complex that it's very difficult sometimes to get our head around them. And one of the points that I wanted to sort of raise, and you were talking about sort of shifting populations. Bear in mind, there's like 10 million people that have moved out of Ukraine and within Ukraine since the war started. And imagine, just comparatively speaking, the hurricane in Florida and that displaced population. What if they were never allowed to go back? How do you house them? What do you do with their jobs? Just like you're talking about, that economic factor that is just continually happening over and over again. And so, I think that we need to take the opportunity to learn from these experiences. This is actually sort of in the most unfortunate way, it's a living lab for us right now as we're watching this and seeing how things unfold. And one of the things that has been coming up really quite a bit lately is payment systems. How do
Mm.
you pay people in these environments? How do you get them their pension? How do you, deliver aid when the systems are not working? And I think this is something that is, we're having to learn this. And it's not just, it's, sort of like you said, to the right of boom or whatever it is, that in terms of we're dealing with the effects of a single incident. This is like, you can't get access to your bank for 6 months. What do you do? And these are like the significant problems that have been encountered in Ukraine. And that is, unfortunately, it's trucks and money, that you have to sort of go out for. And some of the aid that's initially just delivered is cash, because we've got to get people some money so at least they can try and sustain themselves. And so there's a wide array of complex problems to look at. And what we're trying to do is really just see what's taking place and see what is going on. Another really quick example is you can look at that recent Iranian drone video where it was flying over Odessa. And you've got territorial defense, or basically like equivalent of a National Guard, are out there trying to shoot it down with small arms fire because it was too low to be targeted with anti-air. It sounds like a lawnmower flying over your head, but you've got, they're actively trying to shoot it down because it's going to target a building. And that's all sort of, if it wasn't for the National Guard, it would have been the police, but it's all sort of civilian response wrapped up in that, in this, completely unique type of event. And so we're watching these things and trying to learn the lessons from these to try and figure out, what does that tell us about how we need to be prepared and how we need to respond. And getting in towards the end of 2022, I think it just reemphasizes the need for communities. Communities need to be strong. We all remember the pictures of them making Molotov cocktails, preparing for the invasion. This is where all this is originating from, and communities need to be strong in dealing with these really significant periods of instability, whether that's from a natural disaster or prolonged instability due to the grids and rolling blackouts and everything else that goes along with that.
Community resiliency is frightening to think about. You're talking about the cash hands off, and I want to ask you about that actually, because I deal with that quite a bit here, obviously in the U.S., of a cultural conflict. People think, oh, don't give people money, give them things. But you're saying, in your experience, that basically in the beginning here, you're dealing with so much that it's actually better just to hand them cash. Can you give an example of that conflict between things versus cash, and maybe the pros and cons of both?
Well, I think if you spend any time in the humanitarian sort of sector, you'll find that cash delivery programs are very successful. Because that you're, instead of, the transportation and logistics of goods and things like that, you're just delivering, the immediate cash benefit. They can use it immediately. They can spend that money. If you're afraid that they're going to do something with it, what are you really afraid of? I mean, if in periods of specifically conflict, they need food and water. They haven't had money for 6 months. What do you think that they're going to actually do with it? They're not going to go buy a car.
Right.
So I understand how theoretically and probably in reality, some people do use cash for certain reasons. But if you look at the overarching effect, you need to understand that cash is one of the most effective mechanisms. And it doesn't have to be simply just in the Ukraine conflict, but it could be, you look at the cash delivery programs that the many international organizations use across Africa, across everywhere. And it's one of the dominant ways that aid is delivered, and especially in very austere environments where you may not be able to access, or bring in large trucks for logistics deliveries.
The pushback that I always provide, and thank you so much for saying that, and I agree. I'll tell people, I said, well, when they push back on giving out cash handouts, I'm like, do you believe an 80% solution is enough? And they usually say yes in emergency management and military lingo. That's kind of thing. If 80% of your population, which would still be low, I think, comparatively, if you actually look at the data, if 80% of the population used it for the right thing, i.e. food and water, and 20% used it to buy stupid stuff, one of their PS5 or whatever it might be, hopefully it's something positive like that. But even if it was that big of a number, that disparity, you just saved 80% of the population from you having to handhold somebody through a problem. We have to start thinking, and going back to the civil defense mentality here, that these disasters are so large, whether natural or man-made, that you can't hold hand everybody. There's just not enough people. There's not enough resources to do that. And we need to also articulate to that public of, you are responsible for you. We will give you everything that we can in order to help you. However, at one point you need to act as well. and start handing over some of that onus, just so that we can speed up the response and recovery time. And I think people want that as well. I think they want to speed up recovery. But when you're blasted by everything and the whole world is literally blowing up around you, and you're 10 million people evacuating a country, or you're several hundred thousand people, who are dramatically impacted by a hurricane or otherwise, at one point, you have to empower people to start acting. Otherwise, they will stay in a state of crisis, right? Like, that's the big lesson from Japan. I'm probably talking too long here, but the Japan crisis was another unfortunate lab where researchers went in there and they said, "We're going to give you a really tight schedule. You're going to wake up all at the same time. You're going to eat all at the same time. We're going to give you healthy food and exercise and all these things to essentially trick the body and empowering people to start doing things." And those populations who did that recovered so much faster because the endorphins would release and they would feel a sense of normality, and they'd be able to act, versus treating people like they can't do anything because they're in a state of crisis. And funny enough, it's exactly opposite, right? Empowering people actually allows them to recover faster than treating them like a victim. I don't know. That's just kind of my perspective on it, but
Yeah, and I think sort of the simplest explanation is the easiest, which is how rapidly do you want to help people?
ooh, I like that.
And it's really, if you get into an area and you're in limited space, limited time, and you have a limited capability, you want to help people as rapidly as possible. So give them the most flexible options that you possibly can, right? And address immediate
Yes.
need. If you have to sort of divide people, like, oh, well, you don't need socks, you need t-shirts, so wait for 3 days till we come back and bring you t-shirts, or whatever the case is, on a very simple example. But this is where you do the greatest amount of help in the shortest amount of period by
Mm.
some of these programs.
Yeah, I like that. In fact, I wrote that down while we were talking. I think you just gave us the mic drop moment. Kyle, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Especially you overseas. We do so much here in the United States, and we sometimes we have the blinders on a little bit. But the what's happening around the world impacts the United States and vice versa. And we need to help, whether the communities are in Germany or in Florida. We need to help empower people to take control of their own lives, build that almost that civil defense, or that resiliency model. I'm going to do a quick shout out for my Task Force 46 friends who are focusing so much on civilian military operations. That's another thing that we should probably have you back on the show to talk about that. But there's a lot of people focusing on it around emergency managers. My call out is that emergency managers need to start working better with those humanitarians, those military groups, even private sector partners, to start helping people build up their level of resiliency so that they can go out. And I think that's a really strong message in the ending of 22, especially as everyone's aware of it. They're aware of what's happened in Fort Myers. They're aware of what's happening in Ukraine. When these unfortunate situations happen, we have to be cognizant enough to capitalize on it for their good. And I'm not talking about work. I'm talking about helping people, do something while they're thinking about it. I don't know. What are your final thoughts on 2022? What should an emergency manager or a crisis manager focus on?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I mean, what I can tell you is, as we head towards the end of 2022, we are looking at basically the lines are blurred now:
Mm,
public, private, military, civilian. And so it really is a whole government approach. And we're looking at it from the perspective of, even when I was in Ukraine, we saw the military administration come in, take over for the civilian administration. You see them sort of take over key functions for security, and you
mm.
see all these things unfolding. And in public private partnership, spinning up the industrial base, bringing things back online. And that's where I think the lines are completely blurred. And we have to be very comfortable in the space of integrated capabilities and interoperability amongst all these different segments of society. Because it takes, and really in these really, tremendously insecure environments, it takes everything and everybody.
I don't know how many mic drops a person's allowed in a single podcast, but you keep on doing it. So, uh, Kyle, again, thank you so much for coming on. The lines are blurred. you're definitely in that blurry space right now. You do so much with NATO and with the UN and with humanitarian groups. And if nothing else, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and pushing forward this conversation because it's much needed for our field. So
I appreciate it. The pleasure's all mine.
Good. It should be. It's a fun job, right? At the end of the day, you have a good job. All right. So if you like this episode, which you should have, we want you to like and subscribe it. When we want to give you a 5-star rating. Comment on social media. We have so many people who send emails, and I'm so grateful for those emails. But I'm pushing every week. I push you guys to be brave enough to ask your questions on social media. Allow Kyle King to answer some of those questions. I'm also going to give him one more shout out because Kyle not only is the CEO of
Capacity Building International.
Capacity Building International, he also often posts about all these jobs that are happening. And if I wasn't the CEO of Doberman and having a good time with my team, I'd probably apply for one of those jobs. They look really fun. But either way, he's doing a lot to help out the field. He's helping out professionals by giving job options. He's giving you some really good advice here and letting you know about the trends that are happening internationally, which definitely impact you if you live in the United States. And so pay attention to that. Follow Kyle King on like LinkedIn, follow Disaster Tough Podcast, ask a question, provide your comments, and we'll see you for the next one.